The ANC NEC virtual meeting is underway, but like many of us, suspended Secretary-General Ace Magashule is in the dark about proceedings. He was removed from the meeting earlier. Magashule was suspended on Wednesday after he failed to step aside from his position. He's facing multiple criminal charges. Let's get reaction to this now with Qaanitah Hunter, News 24 political editor and political analyst, Professor Sipho Seepe, joining me in studio here. Welcome, Professor, and welcome, Qaanitah, to you as well. Let's start with you, Professor. Secretary-General Ace Magashule was removed from the virtual NEC meeting, as we know. He claims his appeal against the suspension means his suspension is no longer effective, and that's why he should be part of that meeting. But surely the SG can't expect us to believe that it's as simple as that. His appeal does not remove the suspension, surely.
Yeah, there's always a process when it comes to issues of disciplinary processes. And they are not just automatic. It's not like you're saying, I intend to appeal, and I send a letter of appeal, and then automatically you get in. The appeal must be considered. And after consideration, there'll be a decision. It's the same as it happens in the courts, that simply lodging an appeal does not mean that automatically there is a suspension of whatever sanction. What it means is that there'll be a process that must be followed. Some people will listen to the appeal, whether it has merit, and then on the basis of that, then indicate to you whether the suspension is being upheld. So that is a process. But we must also understand that this suspension comes after a process. There was a very clear process that Magashule was part of. He had accepted also the notion that says, I will consult with the elders. And having done so, then I'll make my position clear. But as soon as you're saying you are going to consult on the basis of a decision that has been made, you have already put yourself in a corner. And all that needed to do was a question of people say, well, we'll give you 30 days and we'll wait. But you had already accepted. So the problem with him is that he is now raising issues that should have been raised much earlier. He's actually correct in a sense that says the resolution of the ANC in the conference has been modified. But this is something that he should have handled then, because what has happened here is that the NEC of the ANC, in an attempt to implement that, has come to a position to say, as it says, the resolutions as those who have been accused of and reported to be. But the NEC has looked at those who have been charged, and a charge by the NPA also amounts to an accusation. So it is one part of the resolution. So for him to start raising all other issues is it does not put him in a good state. Politics is about persuasion, and it's also about getting public sympathy. So you don't raise the issues at the end, which you should have ventilated much earlier. And this is where he finds himself out in the cold.
Professor, I'm going to come back to you. Also joining us at the moment is Power to Truth anchor JJ Tabane. JJ, let me ask you this. Was it a lack of foresight on the part of the ANC not to put in place appeals processes when they demanded that those charged step aside? Surely appeals processes can't only be thought of at number 99.
No, absolutely. But remember that the step aside, that whole situation. Good afternoon to you, by the way, and good afternoon to the Prof. The step aside situation does not nullify the processes that already exist within the disciplinary processes in the ANC. Those disciplinary processes already have appeal processes. In other words, when they say if you don't step aside, we will suspend you, it means that immediately you are suspended. Then the process that normally obtains when ordinary members of the ANC are suspended will kick in. And that process has a range of appeal processes right up to the NEC. So in a sense, you could say that they assumed that they will use their normal processes once someone is suspended. I mean, it's always good to err on the side of caution, and maybe in their guidelines, they should have added how do you appeal if, for example, you step aside and you want to appeal that particular situation.
Qaanitah, let's bring you in now. Thanks also for joining us here. Let's talk about rumblings from within the NEC meeting. Of course, we're all in the dark here, but perhaps some of us in the room or you on Skype are a little bit more connected than the rest of us. What have you been hearing from inside the meeting? We know that Ace Magashule's his supporters had said that they were going to disrupt the meeting if he had been left out of it.
Well, I mean, Ace Magashule very predictably tried to be part of the meeting today, and that obviously raised the ire of those supporting President Cyril Ramaphosa. It was almost an hour of debate on whether he should actually be in the meeting. The meeting started with the Deputy Secretary-General saying to the meeting that Ace Magashule had appealed his suspension, but the counter-argument was that the appeal was not heard, that they still did not, there's still a procedural matter to deal with it, and so as long as this meeting was happening, is that the Secretary-General of the ANC is suspended. He obviously insists that he's still the SG of the ANC. Before the NEC started, there was another little meeting that took place with the Women's League's National Working Committee and the officials of the ANC. It was a brief meeting. In that meeting, Ace Magashule participated. Obviously, you would know that the Women's League had their own drama about whether they should support and Ace Magashule in his defiance, and the majority of the Women's League had come out to say that they should not be picking up the fight of men leaders in the ANC, and that they should support the step-aside policy. And then there was this meeting that was meant to happen in the morning between officials of the ANC and the NWC of the Women's League, where Magashule was present in that meeting. It was very short-lived because ANC chairperson Gwede Mantashe cut them short, saying, you know, you have your president that sits in the NEC of the ANC, you have the Secretary-General of the Women's League that sits here as well. Tell them to raise these issues in the NEC because the NEC is still going to meet. And so there was this back and forth, for over an hour, whether Ace Magashule, as well as Bongani Bongo, ANC MP Bongani Bongo, who is facing corruption charges as well, should have been present. By the end of it, they were kicked out of the meeting, and then President Cyril Ramaphosa continued with his political overview. This is when the debate about why was this meeting happening virtually then ensued, because there was arguments that the president, the last NEC rather, had decided that NEC meetings should be happening physically now as a result of leaks, etc., at the last meeting, and that was then the bone of contention. Obviously, what's happening now, we are in the dark.
Qaanitah, I'm going to come back to that issue of the virtual meetings in a moment, but while we're talking about the ANC Women's League, I want to touch on that with you. The SG, Ace Magashule, naming the SG of the ANC Women's League in an interview. What's the deeper story there?
Yeah, so I mean, that was quite interesting in that he was counting on the Women's League support and the Secretary-General of the Women's League to support him against his suspension. But on Thursday, the National Working Committee of the ANC's Women's Leagues met, and they were discussing maybe marching on the ANC, in support of Ace Magashule, or having a meeting with officials to support him, and that was vehemently opposed in the meeting on Thursday. Then on Friday, there was an urgent meeting last night of the NEC of the Women's League discussing this matter. What should the position of the Women's League be? And Batabile Dlamini, the president of the Women's League, she raised the argument, or is said to have raised the argument that, it's about uniting the ANC. The step-aside thing is causing divisions in the party, and therefore it should be deferred. And then it sort of opened the tap of a whole lot of women leaders coming forward and saying that the real victims of corruption are women. When women leaders are asked to step aside, for example, the MEC of Health in the Eastern Cape, Sindisa Gomba, was told to step aside. The Women's League was nowhere to be found. So why then is the Women's League then wanting to support Ace Magashule? And then by this morning, there was a statement issued where the Women's League was very clear that it supported the suspension of the ANC, obviously with the caveat that all resolutions of conference of the ANC should be implemented. Obviously, that has been a rhetoric of Ace Magashule and his supporters, but the reality of it is that, Magashule could not count on the Women's League support, at least in this NEC meeting, as it was very clear that they were with the broader NEC of the ANC saying that the step-aside decision should be implemented.
Professor Seepe, let me come back to you now, and I want to talk about the proxemics of NEC meetings and this idea of the virtual meeting versus physical meetings. Obviously, in a physical meeting, it's very easy to keep a visual track of your supporters, those who are perhaps voicing dissent that you hadn't expected, while in a virtual platform, that's a little bit harder to track. Do you think that's any part of the argument for and against virtual versus physical meetings at the moment?
Well, there are a number of considerations. I mean, one, we have COVID, so the notion of a virtual meeting is something that has become standard. But if the organization has come up to a position that we can find a room where we can deal with issues of social distancing, it's up to the organization to decide that. But it's also possible that with COVID, the whole notion of traveling from one place to another is also to expose, risk exposing some members of the ANC to COVID, and we've seen people dying, so we should take it very seriously. But there are also other considerations. The issue of you being aware who said what, it's something that would happen. I mean, we participate in virtual meetings, and the screen does indicate who speaks. And also, people know whose voice, people know each other's voice, otherwise there will be no possibility of engagement. So I don't take the issue of tracking to be a great challenge. The challenge, however, would be if people congregate in a particular place. It may be so easy for other people to bus a number of supporters to go and create mayhem. So it is, I think the virtual meeting, if it is decided against the decision that was taken that we're going to have a physical meeting, it may be that major consideration that we do not want to have a disruption, hordes of people bust, and making it difficult for us to transact the business of the organization.
JJ, let me come back to you here. There are rumours of a possible suspension, or rather expulsion from the party of the suspended SG Ace Magashule. What do you make of those rumours?
Well, I don't think they'll go to that extreme at the moment, unless Ace Magashule does something more drastic than simply defying his suspension. But remember, he must, once you are suspended, it assumes a disciplinary process, right? And it may well be that that process, the ANC will handle it in such a way that it will mitigate what is already a very corrosive situation that would lead to division. So I think that it would be an extreme view, given the support that Ace Magashule has, to go down the path of the suspension, of expulsion. This is too early days to go that far. As I was saying in an earlier interview, I think the NGC may end up being the one that comes in to calm those waters. Like we've seen when Jacob Zuma was fired by Thabo Mbeki previously, we all thought that it was all done and dusted. And then that was reversed in a sense by political developments, including the NGC taking a dim view of how the leadership were fighting at the top. By the way, just to comment on what Professor was saying earlier, one of the big considerations about virtual versus physical meeting is the leaking of information to influence political developments. If you are having a virtual meeting, it's easy for anybody to record that meeting, whereas if in a physical meeting, they have discipline of taking away the phones and creating a sense of confidentiality. What we have seen with snippets of meetings of the NEC being leaked across the country was quite embarrassing, because every organization deserved that private space to discuss amongst themselves. But like what Professor is saying, well, we don't have that luxury now with COVID, ravaging, and we are now going into the third wave. So it's important that also the balance of lives also be taken into account.
JJ, while I've got you on the line, let's talk about splinter groups, factionalism, deep divisions within the ANC, talks have been growing to such an extent that we have to think about splinter groups having moved away. What impact do they really have on the ANC in the long run? Or do those who move away eventually gravitate back towards the ANC like many have done in the past?
It happens. I mean, you have to look at the track record of splinters. Splinters have not been effective in the ANC. You have to start far back as the PAC, right? I mean, it has virtually disappeared, but it started as a splinter of some sort. Then we had the UDM. You know, it has left you 2 members of parliament. You know, Cope, we all know. I mean, it became a disaster. Very good idea, but executed very badly. Another splinter. The EFF itself considered a splinter. It has done very well for itself, but it's still at 10%. In other words, if it has to govern, it still has 40% to go, to be at 50% and be, given any sense of governing. We saw in the local government elections, although they ended up being some kind of kingmakers, they were not even given one municipality to govern, which shows you the reluctance of the public to switch sides when it comes to ANC. So the track record doesn't look too good for splinter groups. It may well be that what you need is a fresh start, of something that is not a chip of the old ANC, but a fresh start that can give South Africans a sense of renewal, a sense of a new alternative, etc. It's something that, Democrats have to dream of, that one day you can have a proper alternative and not just another version of the ANC.
Qaanitah, let me bring it back to you. The NEC is set to discuss an independent body to review these suspensions. But, of course, we have to take into account that factionalism may prevent such a body from being truly independent, correct?
Yeah, but there is this assertion that veterans of the ANC are not factional, and so there are names that are being touted, veterans of the party, to come and be part of this panel, so that the NEC. So if you appeal, it gets processed by this panel, and then this panel then submits a report to the NEC, and then the NEC will then make a decision on it. You'll remember that it would be almost impossible for the NEC to consider appeals of every single person affected. In the Eastern Cape alone, there are 23 people, KZN 13 people. I mean, the numbers are just wild. And so there has to be some procedure in place, away from suspended Secretary-General Ace Magashule, just to allow for everyone to hear the case. The big argument that has been raised over and over again is what happens when cases drag on indefinitely and you have postponements after postponements. For example, Bongani Bongo is crying foul because he says when he appeared in court this week, his matter was postponed to January 2022. The case of Mike Mabuyakulo in KZN, for example, he has been facing these charges since 2012, even before he was elected in his position as deputy chairperson of the ANC in KZN. And so that is going to be something that's going to be ongoing for the ANC. And there's a little clause that had been sneaked in, or maybe sneaked in is a bit too wild, but there's a clause that says that each person's case can be reviewed when there's an update or every 6 months. So, I mean, it's very likely that Bongani Bongo, I'm just using him as an example, could be suspended for now, but in 6 months' time he can make a representation to this appeals body and say there's been no movement. This is the communication I've gotten from the NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority, and then they can make a decision whether he can be included or not. One other thing that I am looking at this meeting, or the outcomes of this meeting for, is clarity around what happens to public representatives who earn salaries from the state when they are suspended or when they have stepped aside. We know in the suspension letter of Ace Magashule, he is going to be suspended on full pay. We know that he earns about 130,000 rand a month, according to court papers, and so he's still going to get his salary. But what happens to an MPL, for example, or a MP? Do the rules of legislatures allow for these long absence of these representatives while they're dealing with their criminal cases? And I think that that's what the ANC NEC needs to tighten in today and tomorrow's meeting.
Of course, another issue we have to take into consideration is that the duties of those who are suspended need to be fulfilled by someone. I'm going to come back to you, Professor Seepe. The duty fell on the Deputy SG, Jessie Duarte, to essentially suspend her boss. How difficult do you think that letter was for her to write? She also has to take over his duties. Questions have been asked. Does she have what it takes? What is your perspective?
No, I mean, you need to understand that organizations delegate functions to individuals. And the decision to suspend is not the decision of the Deputy Secretary of the ANC. It's the decision that has been taken by the NEC. And that decision was also informed by a conference resolution. We may quibble with whether the totality of the conference resolution was adhered to, but the point is that it has been a process within the organization. And the NWC, following the decision by the NEC, confirmed that decision. So all she had to do, she may have been asked by the top 5 that remain to simply say, write a letter. So this is more of a carrying out a ministerial function of putting together a decision that has been taken. What the NEC may need to do now is to say, given that the Secretary-General of the ANC has been suspended, how is this function going to be, or those responsibilities going to be dealt with? And then they will then delegate. So the NEC of the ANC must be seized with that decision, as many other decisions that it has to deal with, because this is a uncharted territory, so there are a lot of issues that it must deal with, especially the one that just has been raised by Qaanitah, that the issue of what about members of parliament and legislature, provincial legislature, if they step aside, are they still going to get money? And it's easy for the organization to deal with it. So you have a conflation of issues that must be sorted out, that there must be a greater issue of clarity. Otherwise, you're going to have people are going to cry out that he is being paid, we are not being paid. Why are we having double standards? So these are the issues that they must grapple with.
Absolutely, there needs to be uniformity in those decisions. Let's have one last question for you, JJ Tabane. Local government elections are, of course, also on today's agenda. The NEC is not totally focused only on step-aside resolutions. But is the ANC in any position at this point to take part in elections when they're so consumed by infighting?
In fact, there should be a second reason to postpone the elections, even if it's by a year, because I'm not sure what the enthusiasm to have the elections this year is all about when we're in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, all you have to look as to what's happening in India after their own elections there went ahead despite the pandemic. It's a bloodbath, and I'm not sure why it's not sensible to postpone the elections by mere resolution of Parliament, given that there is a pandemic. The ANC in any event not in a position to go in this tattered format to an election. So if I were their strategist, I would be advising them, you've got 2 reasons now to postpone the local government elections, even if it's by a year. Allow the issue of vaccination to happen and not come and regret having lost people, over an election that could have happened, 12 months, from October this year. So this rush towards the election, despite the pandemic, to me is bizarre. And I think that I hope that some cool heads can prevail in this regard, and the ANC can see sense, not just only because the political climate is bad for them with the divisions that are happening, but also that there's a pandemic where the vaccination program that they have failed to roll out so far will mean that we are going to be facing a lot of deaths that are unnecessary. If we are to bring out people are going to be doing door to door and just spreading the virus like no other event can, because this one involves every one of us, and they should be using that energy to vaccinate the population rather than try to get people out of their homes to go and vote.